Hey there. I am going to re-record the material that we covered in class because unfortunately I didn't hit save. So I'm going to go through the material a little bit quicker than I did in class because you have the benefit of rewinding, pausing, fast forwarding, etc. As you can see, there's a lot of material that's going to be covered. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this up into two videos. The first one that you're watching right now will focus on texturing in Rhino, and the second one will focus on Enscape. The first thing I want to do is cap edges, and in class I use site model add-made, but essentially what we mean by capping edges is creating the, you can think of it as a poche as we cut through the ground, just so when we're making our axonometric drawings, we don't have kind of ugly dangling undersides of surfaces visible. So it's essentially a 3D version of a section cut. To do this, essentially I'm just going to draw a rectangle around the file which I have here. If you want to refer to this file, it is in the Dropbox and it is under the 2002-12 site textures folder. So it's this model right there. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new layer. I'm going to call this, I'll just call it side sections. I'll set it as current. And then I'm going to go into the top view and I'm going to draw a rectangle, making sure that project is on so that we are projected to the C-plane. And I'm just going to draw a rectangle that I'm going to use for my section cut. So as you can see, maybe I want to crop out some of these houses here. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to extrude this rectangle up to create surfaces. So I'll go surface, extrude, curve, straight. I have both sides on right now, so you can just click both sides off if that's the case. And you'll just drag it up like so. So it's covering the entirety of the height of the site model. I just deleted that original curve. We can turn off our Meerkat ortho image. That's what I just did there. As well as any kind of other random stuff you have outside. So I have a few lines. Maybe I'll just delete them. I don't really need them. And afterwards, I'm just going to select all the objects that are intersecting with this section rectangle, and I will just make sure to select them like so. And then I'll just hit split here, or you can type split. So select cutting objects, select this rectangle, and like that, these objects are split. So I'll select the portions of the objects which are outside our section rectangle like so. Yep, looks good, looks good. And that is that. Now what we're going to do, and make sure that you select all the overlapping surfaces like this. So when you see this strange kind of almost a weird animal type print, maybe this kind of pattern here, that just means two surfaces are overlapping. So you can just select that, and delete it so you don't see that kind of weird, maybe moire effect. So I'll select this extruded rectangle and I will just hit split. So split, and then I will just select all of the objects I want to split it with. So this includes the ground and the buildings. And once you have everything selected, just hit enter. And that took a couple of minutes, so I've just, with the magic of editing, gone rid of some of the extra recording. But essentially, your final result should look something like this, and you can just delete the top surface like so. Now, for all these little sections of the surface, you can see it's split up in numerous different ways. You can just select all of these edge surfaces, hit join, And to get rid of all these little poly surfaces, you can just go to Solid Edit Tools, Faces, Merge All Faces. And that'll just create a nicer surface with less subsurfaces. Now we'll apply our first, oh, missed one there. So again, I can just go Join, and then I can go Solid Edit Tools, Faces, Merge All Faces. Now what I can do is I can just assign a material to this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign a material to this by layer. So the first way you can assign a material to an object in Rhino is by going to its layer. So in this case, side sections, hitting the little circle under the material header, and I'm going to make a new material. So this little pop-up screen will come up. And to make a new material, you can just click the little addition sign here. So use a new material. We'll go custom, and we can label this side section like so. And you'll see that on our custom settings we can choose or change some things. So there's color, gloss finish, reflectivity, transparency. We'll change our color to black like so. And for this, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to go down to Advanced Settings, and we're going to click Self-Illumination. And essentially what this means is this object will not receive light in the way that a non-illuminated surface will. So for example, if our color were white instead of black, this would be a way to render a light standard or a light bulb or something like that. So we'll click on self-illumination. Since our color is black, essentially it'll create a Fanta black type material, which will be totally solid black regardless of the lighting conditions in the overall model. So once that is all done, we'll just click OK. And if we go to rendered mode, you can see that we get this solid black all around our model. So referring back to my notes, we've done capping edges. So we've done materials by layer. So now the next thing I want to show you is materials on an object. So to assign a material to an object, simply what you can do is we'll just leave everything on rendered mode. Maybe I'll go to my display tab and turn on surface edges just so we can see the edges of our surfaces. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make a new material. So to make a new material, click the little paint tube here. If you don't have the little paint tube there, you can just click the little gear, go to materials. So I'm going to click the little paint tube, and I'm going to hit the addition icon again. Again, I will go custom, and I will make a gravel material. So I'll just call it gravel. Now, before we just assigned a solid color to this side section material, now we want to assign a texture. So what we can do is we can go and we can scroll down to the textures, submenu of this sidebar, and under color, we can go click to assign texture. Now, essentially, if you look in the Dropbox folder, under the class files, under 2002-12 site textures, I've put a few textures in here. So I'll talk about how I make them, but for right now, I just want to show you how you make a basic material. So site textures, textures, and I will choose the gravel texture that's in the site textures/textures folder. So that is that. And essentially what we can do is we can just select an object and assign a texture to it. So for example, if we want to assign a gravel texture to, let's just say, this area behind the industrial building here, we can go to our materials tab, hover over the material you want to assign to this surface, you'll right click and you'll go assign to objects. Now you can see we have a giant gravel texture over top of that surface right there. Another thing I want to mention is that you can do something called a bump map. And essentially a bump map, if we click on just underneath textures, under our materials tab, go to bump, you can essentially just choose a grayscale image of the same texture. And what this is going to do, I'll click open, is it'll add this bump texture to it. So wherever light is cast within this scene, the bump texture will respond to that as if this image were sort of like a 2.5D image. I'll show you quickly how to make a bump map. So essentially all you're going to want to do is open Photoshop. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to find your file. So again, I'll navigate to the Dropbox location. So here's our Gravel file that I found. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Image, Mode, Grayscale, discard the color information, and then Image Adjustment Levels. And essentially you just want to sort of make this image a little bit higher contrast. And essentially what this is going to do is anywhere where there's black within this bump map image, the bump is going to recede. So it's going to be an area that receives less light, falls into shadow, and any area which is bright white will stick out the most. Now, you would just click OK, and then you would save this image as, let's say, for instance, Gravel Bump, which I already have here. So, but you would just save as Gravel Bump, and then you would go into Rhino and assign your Gravel Bump. Now, if you want to increase or decrease the amount of the bump, you can always just, if you want less bump, you can sort of go down here. So, for example, you want 50% the bump, you got 50% the bump. If you want to go more than 100%, you're starting to get into something called a displacement map, and that we can cover another time. For this kind of project, it's less useful. So one thing to mention here is that this pattern is way too big. So what we're going to do is we're going to essentially repeat it in a tile-like manner in order to get it down to a proper size. So in order to do that, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to select the surface that we want to rescale its texture. We're going to click on the Properties tab here, so that's the little rainbow donut, and we want to click on Texture Mapping. So we'll click Texture Mapping. And what texture mapping is essentially tells Rhino how you want to position and scale and repeat a given texture on a surface or poly surface or mesh in Rhino. And you have a lot of different ways to apply mapping. For anything which is a fairly horizontal surface like this, the go-to is planar mapping. So we're going to apply planar mapping to this surface, and then that's going to allow us to predictably and reliably scale the texture on the surface. So click Apply Planar Mapping, and you'll see what's going to happen is you're going to sort of define a plane, so hence planar mapping. So we are going to go into our top view. Maybe I will set it to rendered. And essentially you have a few options here. So you can just go with default, which we'll do 3-point, sort of play around with these. We'll do 3-point afterwards as an example. But essentially for this case, what you can do is you can just drag a rectangle over the extent of the surface like so. It'll come up with this next little prompt, UV or UVW. 99.9% of the time you'll just choose UV, so that means we want to think of this texture in UV spaces where U is this red axis here and V is that green axis there, so we'll click UV. And now you can see the texture's already been sort of remapped because it's in a new UV coordinate system. And then what we can do now is, again, we can just select that surface. And then in our texture mapping tab here, we can just change our UV repeat. So for example, U is this direction here. If we want to sort of repeat this pattern tenfold across this direction, we can just type 10. And now you can see the pattern is sort of repeated 10 times, and that's why it looks kind of smushed in this axis right here. If we want to repeat this texture 10 times in the V direction, we just type 10 in V. And now you can see we have a little bit more reasonable sized gravel pattern for this surface. So if we go into perspective again, we look at it, we can see that we have this gravel surface that is more reasonably scaled. One thing worth noting is even when you do tile this pattern, essentially you might see your eye will pick up on the repetition of the pattern, and this is just something that you can fix sort of post-render, post-Enscape in Photoshop. One thing that I want to point out at this point is the idea of tiling or seamless textures. So for example, let's go to our web browser of choice and look up gravel texture. I'll go to images and I'll just choose a random one. Let's say this one here. I will save this image in the Dropbox folder, so if you want to play around with this one, it'll be in there as well. Site textures, under textures, and what I'm going to call this is gravel not tiled. So what I mean by that is this texture right here is tiled. So essentially, if we look at the texture itself, so this one right here, what that means is that this edge will match perfectly with this edge. This edge will match perfectly with this edge. So when you array this in a checkerboard type fashion, it'll create this seamless image. What happens when you don't have a seamless image is, and what I'll do is I'll just replace the material here. So I'm going to go to the material, I'll go to gravel, I'll click on the color section of the menu to replace the image. So I'll click gravel. I'll just, so you can see that it gives us a few more settings. Essentially, I'm just going to click on the file name. I'll click the three little dots to browse for a file, and I will change it to gravel not tiled. I'll click open. I'll click OK. And now you can see what happens is you can see very clearly we get this kind of edge in the pattern. So you can see that these rocks do not line up properly. So right there, you can see we get this kind of weird break between them. So that's what a non-tiled image looks like. Now, in the next example, I will show you how to sort of fix that in Photoshop. But for now, for this gravel, I'll just switch it back to the standard gravel image we were using before. Like so. So I want to talk about how you can take a tiled image or a non-tiled image and make it tiled. But first, I want to just give you a word of advice. When you are searching for a texture, you want to use two kind of keywords. One is seamless, so gravel texture, add a seamless. The other one will be gravel texture tiled or tileable. And those should get you a little bit closer to a texture which you like. But let's say you have a texture that you really like and it's not tiled. How can you make it tiled? So for this example, I'm going to use this file here called Dirt Road. And you can see I have a dirt road tiled. So I'm going to work with dirt road, and I'm going to show you how to make this texture tiled. So first, let's apply this texture to this sort of surface here, and I'm just using this as an example. So I'm going to first make the material. So I'm going to click on my materials tab. I'll click the plus. I'll go custom. I will call this dirt road. And under color, I'll click to assign texture, and I will choose the dirt road. Now what I'll do is I'll select this object. I'll right click on dirt road and go assign to objects. So you can see that this, for all intents and purposes works pretty well, but let's say that this road were longer, and now we're starting to feel like this texture is really getting stretched out in this direction. So what we can do is we can first apply planar mapping, so like we did in the last example. So I'm going to select the object, I'm going to click on the properties tab, I'm going to click on the texture mapping tab, and then I'm going to click on apply planar mapping. Now, this time we could drag out a rectangle, but since this surface is on an angle, we're going to try a different option. We're going to click 3-point, and then we're going to define our U direction. So in this case, it's long. And then we're going to define our V direction. So in this case, it's that line right there. So you can see U, V, and we will select UV. So now you can see it doesn't look like anything's changed, but what we can do, since we know that we want to repeat this texture in the U direction because it looks kind of stretched out, is we can change the U to, like, let's say 4. So you can see the texture, it still looks a little bit grainy, so maybe we change the U count to 6. And maybe even more, 8. So maybe that looks good enough for us, but we can see right now that this texture really just isn't tiled, right? So essentially you can really apparently see this line. So we're going to figure out how to change that in Photoshop. So you're going to open Photoshop, and you are going to open the texture you want to tile. So in this case, dirt road. And what you're going to do is you're going to go to filter, other, offset. So filter, other, offset. And what this allows you to do is shift your image so that you can sort of address that broken edge directly. So when you shift the image, you know that this edge will match up with this edge, so it's going to tile perfectly that way, but you can see the break right there. You can also shift in the vertical direction if you're sort of tiling in more of the checkerboard manner like we did with gravel. But for this, since we're sort of treating this as a road, we don't have to tile in the vertical direction. We're just going to play around with the horizontal shift. Make sure that wrap around is selected. So once you have your breaks sort of in your sights, click OK. And then simply you can just take the clone stamp tool. You can hold Alt to select where you're going to sample. And once that is set, you can just paint over this break to sort of make it more seamless, like so. There, so that looks better, and maybe you want to get rid of objects like there's that red dot that appears several times, sort of get rid of things that are very obviously repeated. And once that's done, you can simply save your file. So I'm going to go save as, and I will call it dirt road tile. I'll just call it dirt road tiled. So I'm saving over something I had before, but that's okay. So dirt road tiled. And now back in Rhino, we can select this object. We can select the material. So this is going to change the material. And the color, we're going to replace dirt road. So I click on dirt road under color. I click the 3 little dots under file name. And I'm going to go dirt road tiled. Again, click open. Again, click OK. And now you can see that we have a seamless texture, so this dirt road tiles perfectly. So the next thing we want to do, I'll just delete this one right here, is we want to figure out how to tile a curved path. So this is much more difficult because we can't just tile rectilinearly. We need to sort of make this bend around a curve. So in this case, we have this path on our site. We're going to use that same dirt road texture, except we're going to bend it around the curve. So what we're going to do is we're first going to start off in Photoshop, because if you are using a long curved path like this, I found that it works better if you actually avoid tiling whatsoever. So instead, Rhino is just bending along texture rather than tiling and then bending. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to your tiled pattern like we have here, this dirt road. If it's on a background layer like so, you're going to double click that to convert it to a workable layer. And then what you're going to do is you're going to expand this canvas. So we're going to go to Image, Canvas Sides. We're going to lock our expansion of the canvas to the left side. And then what you can do is you can, instead of bringing out your calculator and figuring out what 1.714 times 10 is, you can just put 1.714, or whatever your width is, asterisk, means times, 10. And you can see it just does that little calculation for you there. Click OK. And now what you will see is this larger canvas in our one little tiled road on the edge. So what we're going to do is we're just going to hold Alt and Shift to drag out that tile. Then we'll select both layers, Alt and Shift to drag it out again. Then we'll select all these layers, Alt and Shift to drag it out yet again. And then finally we'll just select all of them, Alt Shift to drag them out. And now you can see we have this longer tiled road. Once you've done that, you can just select all your layers here, right click them and go Merge Layers. So now you just have this long road texture. And then what we can do is we can go to File, Save As, and you probably just want to call this something like Dirt Road Tiled Long. So that's what I have right there. So I'll just save over my previous file. And there we have that long texture. So what we're going to do is we are going to isolate, well actually first we'll make the material. So we'll click on our Material tab, we'll click the little addition icon, we'll go Create Custom Material, we'll call it Dirt Road Long. Under our textures, under Color, I'll click to assign texture, I'll select Dirt Tiled Long, click Open. So we have that dirt road texture. And then what we're going to do now is we are going to assign this texture to this object. So I selected my curved path. I'm going to right click Dirt Road Long and go Assign to Object. So you can see it's assigned to this object, but the UV's all whack, so it doesn't look like much right now. It looks kind of like a weird tiled pattern. And what we're going to do is we're going to select the dirt road, the curved one, and we're going to type isolate. And that's essentially going to hide everything but this curved dirt road, because we sort of want a little bit of room to see how this works. I'm going to click out perspective, go to my top view, and then I'm going to switch to shaded mode, and that'll become apparent why I'm doing that in just a moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use something called the UV editor. So I'm going to select this object here. I'm going to click on the Properties tab. I'm going to click on Texture Mapping, and I'm going to click on UV Editor. Now, what this is doing, it asks you draw out a rectangle, so I'm going to draw it out. And what this rectangle represents is the long rectangular dirt road texture. So you can see this is the dirt road texture right here. So it's this very long JPEG. You can see the reason why this texture looks like so is because this little blue polyline, this kind of wireframe of a mesh, represents how this object is mapped onto this texture. So this, you can see when you select this very skinny mesh, we can use the gumball to kind of drag it out. You can see that this mesh equals this mesh, and that this texture and the way it intersects with this mesh is the way that it is tiled on the actual object. So what we're going to do is we're going to bend this texture mesh so that it is parallel to this long kind of texture we have right here. And in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to flow along a curve. So the first thing we want to do is define the boundaries of this surface here. So I'm going to just select the UV mesh, and then I will go curve, curve from objects, and then duplicate border. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take just this top curve here, and we're going to flow it along a straight line that goes right there. So because we're only going to reference one straight line up here, we only need one line at the top of this UV mesh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this polyline. I'll click explode. I will deselect the ends of the polyline like so, and I'll click join, and that just makes sure that this top polyline is in fact one object. I will deselect it, I will select the ends, and I'll delete. So now I just have this one reference line, and that's all I need. Now what I can do is I will just click polyline, you could just type line, and I will draw a line that is approximately the length of this texture. And again, it will be, I'm not being perfect here, it's approximately the top of the texture as well. So what we're going to do is we are going to, maybe I'll sort of drag out this texture a little bit more, it doesn't really matter. Just going to make it a little bit thicker, let's rotate a bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this UV mesh, I'm going to go to transform, flow along curve, base curve, select near one end. So that's going to be this curve here, but before we do that, we're going to make sure a few settings are correct. So copy needs to be no, rigid needs to be no, stretch needs to be yes. So make sure copy no, rigid no, local, I don't know what that means, leave it as default, stretch equals yes. And then it says base curve, select near one end. We're going to select our curve we've taken from the top edge of this UV mesh. So I selected that curve we had right there. And then target curve, we're going to select near the matching edge, so that's right there. And you can see what this does is it takes the texture and it aligns it to this top curve. So I can delete our sort of top edge curve. And what I'll do now is this needs to be scaled 1D this way. So then I'll go scale 1D. I'll just select this vertex here. I'll go somewhere beneath it and I will scale this out. Like so. Now you can see it's not totally perfect here. There's a few ways we can kind of fix this. One thing you could do is you could try bending it, but you know, for all intents and purposes, I think this is, I'm not liking how this looks. So essentially what we can do is we can go to edit, control points on. You can press F10. I didn't just because it would stop my recording. And you can select all the control points of these vertices, and you can select just the control points and sort of drag them down to kind of massage them into place to where they need to be. So I'm just selecting the control points there, I'm dragging them down, and what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to best match this edge. So it doesn't have to be totally perfect, but it more or less needs to flow along the edge here. So that's what I'm doing. Now I'm not going to make this totally perfect just for the sake of, you know, not spending 20 minutes of dead silence manipulating this, but you get the idea of how you would manipulate this. Like so. And then finally, I'm just going to shrink this a little bit, drag it over here, and like that. So, you know, good enough for jazz. This works. So I just hit escape to turn off the control point editing mode. Once your UV mesh is more or less on top of your texture like this, you can delete that top curve we have. And once this all looks good, you can just click apply under the UV editor menu tab. So we'll click apply. And now if we go back to our perspective window, you can see that the path does flow along the curve quite well, but you can also see it kind of looks like garbage. It's quite pixelated. And I'm not totally sure why this setting matters, to be honest, but what you need to do to get rid of this pixelation is select your bent path, select properties, and then properties. And then under render mesh settings, you're going to have to click custom mesh, and then you're going to have to click adjust, and then you're going to unclick pack textures. So that was render mesh settings, adjust, pack textures off, and then click OK. And then now you can see that the strange pixelation has gone away. So if your mesh still looks kind of you know, there's kind of some weird twists like this, you can always UV edit your mesh again. So again, just go to texture mapping, UV editor, draw out your rectangle again. And then essentially what's happening here where that gets twisted is if you look, let's say it's probably somewhere around here, it just means that you can drag some vertices up or down. Maybe this vertex needs to come up. So you can go through and massage all these things. So again, you can just go to view, edit, control points on, and kind of play around with these to sort of see how your texture looks. So just check it against this. So you can see that if I were to, for instance, drag this all the way down there, you probably, you'll get this weird spiral there. So just avoid kind of huge skews like that. You know, make sure the points more or less look like they should be where they should be, and you'll be able to avoid stuff like that. So I'm going to hit Control-Alt-H, or sorry, Control-Shift-H, and that's going to bring up the objects which are hidden. I'm just going to select all of them, and I'll hit Enter. So now you can see we have this curved path, and it's textured quite nicely. We also have our gravel path here, so that all works. One thing I do want to show you finally is something called box mapping. So what I'll do is I'll select one of the houses and I'll type isolate just so we can look at this in isolation. And essentially, I want to show you how you can map in 3 dimensions and also how you can map on subsurfaces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the Materials tab. I'm going to click the little Addition button. I'll go Custom, and I will make a new material called Vinyl Siding. Under the Vinyl Siding options, I'll go down to Textures Color. I will select Vinyl Siding. If I wanted to, I could reuse this same texture as a bump map. So click Bump. Vinyl siding. Since it doesn't really have any colors anyways, I know what's going to happen is the black lines will recede, the lighter areas will be brought forward into the light, so I can just use this as a bump map. And what I'll do is I'm going to apply it to this house here. However, I'm only going to apply it to several different faces of the house. So in order to select just a few select faces of a poly surface, you can hold Control and Shift, and now you can select faces within a poly surface. So that's Control and Shift, and then select the faces you want. So what I can do now is I can right-click vinyl siding and go assign to objects, like so. Now I'm going to make a new material for the roof. So I'm going to click the little plus button, custom. I'll call this roof shingles. Again, textures, color. I'll choose the asphalt texture I have here. And to apply this to the roof, I can hold Control Shift, select the roof, right click the roof shingles, and go assign to objects. And now you can see I have two different textures in this one poly surface. I want to use box mapping right now because, as you can see, all of these textures are horribly scaled. So I'll select my poly surface, I'll go to Properties, Texture Mapping, and I will choose Apply Box Mapping. And essentially this is just going to ask you to draw out a rectilinear polygon. So again, you can go 3-point if your object's on an angle. I'm just going to draw out a rectangle like so, but then you're going to drag out the rectangle. So it's similar to planar mapping, except you drag out the rectangle at the end stage, hence a box. And then finally, capped. Usually you want to put yes. It just means that there's going to be texture mapping on this top surface. So we'll click yes. And now you can see the textures are starting to make a little bit more sense, and we can repeat them / scale them accordingly. So we can go down to our UVW repeat, turn both of them to, like, let's say 10, and you can see that the texture has been scaled properly. Now you can see that this texture is not tiled, it's not seamless like we talked about, but you now have the tool set to make this seamless if you were totally set on using this vinyl siding. One thing here worth noting is, let's say that you're happy with the way the vinyl siding looks, but you're not happy with the way the roof texture is looking. If you want to have different mappings, you probably just want to explode the object. So you can just select this poly surface, hit explode, deselect the roof, hit join, select the roof, hit join. So now we have two objects, the roof and the sides. And for the roof now you can apply a different mapping. So maybe instead of box mapping, we want to go to apply planar mapping, and we can just apply planar mapping, select UV like we had before. And this allows us to change these two patterns independently. One thing that's worth noting is you can always click Show Mapping as well. And this is going to bring up a widget that allows you to do things like rotate your texture, scale it in one direction, scale it in the other direction. So it might be a more intuitive way for you to apply your mapping. So again, that's just selecting the I'll hide mapping here. That's just selecting the little show mapping icon there. Finally, I'm gonna unhide all my objects. So I put I click Control Shift H. I'll select all. If you want to quickly apply the same mapping to a lot of objects, so let's say we have all these houses here. We're gonna assign that vinyl siding material to them. So material. Again, we can assign by layer, so we can simply just go to our layers tab, BREP buildings, which these are all on. We can assign them a material by the layer, so let's say vinyl siding. Simply what you can do is you could just go to select objects on that layer, deselect this one here because that's what we want to reference, and then go to Properties, Texture Mapping, and then select this little broom icon called Match Mapping. And essentially you just select the object you want to match. So in this case, it's this house right here. Select it, and then you can see it automatically applies the same mapping to all of your objects that you want to match the mapping. So it's just super, super useful. So I think that is about all for the texture video. Like I said, the next video will be focusing on Enscape, and I'm going through this quite quickly. It's sort of a recap of what we did in class, but if you have any questions, of course, send me an email.